Stop having children. I know this is a pretty straightforward, strong thing to say, but this is what this video is all about. I've gathered a list of arguments for procreation that I have run into discussing this philosophical ideology that I think are worthwhile, that I think worth discussing. I haven't exhausted all the arguments for procreation. This list is, of course, not all the arguments for procreation, but just the ones that I heard of and thought I needed to make some counter arguments in favor of anti-natalism. Therefore, we're gonna run them one by one, and let's say where would they take us. Anti-natalism first revolves around the argument that life is suffering, and the pain in life is very much more than pleasure in it. Therefore, there is no need to bring people into existence, and procreating new people and more people is actually harmful, because we do not need to bring somebody who is not existing to existence, because we will subject him to unnecessary harm. Argument number one: life is pleasurable and worth living. People who say that actually observe the human experience, life experience, as a worthwhile experience. So they actually beget children according to this fundamental view that that life is good and worth living and has some inherent good quality in it. But we can easily put some thought experiment to debunk that, if you will. Let's say, for example, if we say that life is pleasurable and worth living, we cannot give notion to pleasure unless there is a notion for pain. We cannot do that because definitions arise from their contradictory definitions. So if we want to say that life is pleasurable, of course you would say life is pleasurable as long as there is suffering, and as long as you are avoiding the suffering, life is pleasurable for you. Therefore, we can say that pleasure and suffering are parallel. But people who support procreation say that pleasure weighs more than suffering in life. Therefore, it's good to bring new people to existence. Okay, we're gonna have a thought experiment to explore this very argument. Let's say, for example, I give you the maximum amount of pleasure there is. The maximum amount. You can think of whatever, the maximum amount of pleasure that you could ever have. Let's say some type of drug or some type of very exotic experience that would give you an enormous amount of pleasure that you could never have. Let's say we can just give it to you now. But shortly after, we're gonna give it to you for like 1 hour. But afterwards, we're gonna subject you to 1 hour of the maximum pain there is. Let's say, for example, burning alive. So, what would your response be? Would you still get into this particular experience? Would you still accept those terms? Be subject to the maximum amount of pleasure there is for 1 hour, but afterwards get subjected to the maximum amount of pain there is. If you say no, I could easily say that this is life, and you are being wise to not choose to get inside this experience, because the weight of suffering is very, very much more heavy than the weight of pleasure. And if I say that the maximum amount of pleasure is very much less than the maximum amount of pain, we could say that across all the scale, like the very minimum amount of pleasure weighs much less than the very minimum amount of pain. And this is what life is. It's just pleasure and pain. So this argument fails right away. So based on that, if you had, let's just say, theoretically, if you had any mind before you were born, before you had physical form, and you knew about this argument, you wouldn't choose to be inside this planet. You wouldn't choose to be alive. It's contradictory, yes, but it just simplifies my case. This takes us to argument number 2. If everyone refrained from having children, we wouldn't be here. Well, there is actually a presupposition in here which is clearly this is good. Like, what are we having right now has a good quality. Like when you say, if you were not born, you wouldn't be here. You are presuming that me being here is a good, which is not, based on my first argument. If we need to, let's say, explore this argument, we need first of all to explore the presupposition, which is us being here in this state is actually a good. But if we say, what is this? This is life. What does life entail? Entails pleasure and suffering. Basically, what you're doing when you just wake up is just looking for pleasure and avoiding pain. Looking for pleasure, avoiding pain. Everything that you do is for pleasure. I'm making this video for pleasure. You're watching it for pleasure. You wake up from your bed for pleasure. You eat for pleasure. You walk for pleasure. You do all sorts of stuff for pleasure. Also, pleasure is avoidance of suffering. Like, for example, you eat. You avoid the suffering of being hungry. Therefore, eating becomes pleasure. Therefore, avoiding suffering is pleasure. So, if we say, and we could agree that life is basically pleasure and pain, and I have already proven that the weight of suffering is already much higher than the weight of pleasure, this becomes irrational. This becomes irrational and illogical, because us being here is not a good but a bad. Life is suffering. This is what it is. Even though yes, we agree that there are lots of pleasure in the world, in life, yes, but always suffering always exceeds the pleasure, however you wanted it. If you even had a lot of money and you were born with a good set of genetics, you had good health and stuff, a lot of things can just go wrong. Argument number 3. If we all adopted this ideology, we will all come to a global extinction. Well, yes, it follows logically, yes. But I could say that the only way to avoid suffering is the absence of life at all. I mean, just look at what's happening right now around the world. This has happened for all human history, and it will carry on happening, just repeating itself. Humans are greedy. This is what it is. The only way to stop suffering is to stop life at all. Like, for example, I don't have children. They're not suffering, yet they're not deprived of anything. You would say that they're deprived of pleasure, but they don't exist. They don't suffer. They are in a state of non-existence. They don't actually experiment any type of pleasure, but they don't experiment also pain. And as I mentioned, the weight of pain is much more than the weight of pleasure. Therefore, it's good. It's good for them and for me also. The history of mankind is full of suffering. And the only way we could stop all of this suffering, all of this pain, all of this misery is just to stop life once for all. Because as long as life exists, it will always lead to suffering. Always. Because suffering is like a tax for life. It's like a tax. I'm saying that as though we wanted to be here, we wanted to get born, but we didn't want to. It's just how it is. It's a tax. Suffering is a tax. And I can say that about humans, and I can say that all about the other organism there is. Life is cruel and life is suffering. You can just say you can see that in force wherever you go. The relationship between animals, between prey and predator, is inherently this. Argument number, I think I've lost count. Well, I don't know. Doesn't matter. This argument has something to do with religion. I mean, when people refrain from giving birth, from having children, they say that this actually contradicts religion. However, I do not support this argument. I have already made a video about it. I do not know about the other religions, but for Abrahamic religions, I think they don't actually support procreation, not support, but actually have some law or some do or don'ts, like do have children, like it's a must, like prayer and lower your gaze, or don't commit adultery or something like that. It's a do. It doesn't exist. It's not present in the scripture. So, like, the problem with this argument, if you say that this contradicts religion, I mean, it doesn't contradict religion because I have just stated that the scripture doesn't have a do or don't for that. Then there is even another problem here. Like, people will just give birth to their children and say, even if life is painful and has a lot of sorrow and misery and suffering, God would reward us. Well, first of all, you do not know for sure that this religion is correct. That's first things first. You just believe. If you could just believe, anyone can believe. Anyone can come up with all sorts of imagination and speculation. And you need, for logical necessity, to accept him as well. Let's just say that your religion is correct. All right? Let's just say for argument's sake, your religion is correct. You do not know that your child, your son or daughter, would be a good follower of religion. You do not know if your son is gonna be a sinner, a wicked person. You do not know that for sure, do you? You do not know whether your son is gonna enter heaven or hell. So you are making such a dangerous bet, don't you think? So the best thing that you could just do is not to bring him to existence at all. Therefore, he's not gonna enter heaven, yes, but he's not gonna enter hell as well. So avoidance of suffering is pleasure. Argument number whatever. I totally forgot. I'm just repeating this to emphasize the fact that I have made a list and this is not utterly random. Okay, so you could follow orderly. This argument says, which is my favorite. This argument says that that me as a father or me as a mother would make it really sure that our son or our children would have a great life experience. What do you think about that? I mean, don't you think that all of the parents in the world have this in mind? Don't you think that all of them say that they will make it sure for their children to have a great life experience? They all have this in mind, but still, bad stuff always happen. Bad stuff always happen. Like, against their will, bad stuff always happen because you cannot control the future. You can't. Bad stuff always happen. This is utterly ridiculous. How can you control? Like, even if you put a lot of effort into raising your child properly and making him attend the best schools and give him a great education, so you're gonna maximize his pleasure in the future. Your son could just run over by a truck, for example, or end up sick with cancer or anything. I mean, the possibilities of things that could just go wrong is huge. It's just huge. And you saying that you would make sure is a very bold thing to say, because you cannot be sure, like be sure. So either you lie, or you do not know, or you try to comfort yourself into it. It's unacceptable either case. The next argument, this argument is pretty good. I have came up with it myself. It actually relates to my previous video, so the ones that have watched my previous video would actually understand this argument much better. This argument says that we do not bring people into existence because they don't exist until they do. So we're not actually bringing anyone to existence because existence is not prior to existence. Your son exists when he does. I'm not bringing him from the void, or from the Nile, the unexistence. This says that your son exists when you see him as flesh in front of you. You're not bringing him from somewhere else because he doesn't exist until he does. Therefore, you are not applying harm into him because you're not bringing him from anywhere else. He exists right in front of you. You're not applying harm because he doesn't exist prior to this existence that you're watching with your own eyes. But the problem here is that you knew all along. You knew the conditions of life. Presumably, you knew the conditions of life, presumably. You still decided to bring him to existence. And his self is going to be formed according to the law of this life. And what type of existence would he have? Is it a good one? Is it a bad one? The weight of suffering and pleasure is very much different. They are very, very, very different. It's like you're comparing an elephant with an ant. Knowing this, you're still doing something presumably unethical. Like if we're gonna say something objective. The next argument, a very short one. Why don't you end it all? Like snap it. Well, this cannot be. You think people could easily end it? Do you think we are biologically tied into this existence? Do you think that doing it is a very much horrible experience that people would just choose to stay away from, would just choose to avoid it? It's not a very pleasant experience. And still, people have just much responsibilities in this world. They can't just do it and end it all. Even though they have this understanding and they have this knowledge about those things, they can't just end it all because of the responsibilities that they have to the other men, the other people, and the biological proclivity to conserve life. And again, you are tied into your life. Like you feel as though a protagonist in a movie or a story. You just want to carry on in your story. You just want to see and observe when it ends. You're curious about it. Like people who do it, they reach a level where when pain is very, very much intolerable, and they just do it. And just remember, you wouldn't do it if you were not here at the first place. You wouldn't do it. You wouldn't get through this horrible experience at all. I think this is the last argument that I have in my list. This argument says that me not giving birth to children rewards me of a particular pleasure, all right? Pleasure of staying clear of conscience. I mean, I haven't subjected anyone against his will to some type of harm, okay? If there is pleasure from that, there is also another pleasure, which is the contradictory of this. Having children, playing with your children, seeing them grow up, have the experience as a mother or a father. This also entails pleasure in it. Therefore, if we have pleasure of anti-natalism, and we have also pleasure of procreation, therefore there are just pleasures, and choosing between them is utterly subjective. I can do what I want, because this argument is put by a moral subjectivist Okay? So this pleasure A, pleasure B, whatever I choose doesn't matter. Whatever I choose. Well, for this type of argument, I have nothing to say actually, because if morality is subjective, you have nothing to say. But for me personally, I have pleasure of not seeing my children live in this chaotic world, planet, or life, whatever you want to call it. My pleasure of this outweighs the pleasure of seeing my children growing up and having the experience of mother and the father. But since morality is subjective, people can just come up with anything they want. But still, you would just bear it in your conscience that you're actually subjecting people to harm. And when they are sick or when they're experiencing suffering in their lives, it would be very, very bad for you as a father or a mother. Trust me. So one who is an anti-natalist say that I want nothing to do with all of that and just stays all the way out of it. Because like the problem is, you would know that your children are suffering, and this suffering shall be even more on your conscience because you know that you are responsible for their own suffering. Because they only suffer because you brought them to existence, while you know deep inside of you that this is not necessary and you could do otherwise. Well, you could not do otherwise because there is no free will. But you get what I'm saying. Having children is not necessary. Yeah. And it would be terrible for you as a father or a mother. I mean, you could just go to the hospitals, for example, and see fathers or mothers just crying out loud on their sick children's bed. It's a very bad experience. I think this is the end of my list. If I ever came up with new arguments for procreation that I decided to debunk, or I came across some other arguments for procreation, I will make another video. But just take this thought experiment with you. If we could subject you to the maximum amount of pleasure for 1 hour, and afterwards subject you to the maximum amount of pain for 1 hour, would it be worth it?